Welcome to part 2 of the Dyslexia 101 module. In the last video, we covered what dyslexia is and isn't. I also shared some research and resources. I'll continue to share resources throughout this module, with most coming in part 3 when we focus on next steps. For now, though, in part 2, we're going to focus on the so what as I attempt to answer the questions you or others may have about why it's important to learn about dyslexia. I felt this quote from Ben Foss's book, The Dyslexia Empowerment Plan, was an important way to start this section. This quote really speaks to the nuance of a dyslexia diagnosis and, most importantly, the support or possibly lack of support in someone's life. He states, dyslexics are 10% of people, 35% of entrepreneurs, and 41% of prisoners. Before we dig into this quote, I wanted to offer a quick point of clarity here. This was in 2013. However, research estimates up to 20% of the population has dyslexia in some form, mild, moderate, or severe. As I was considering this quote from his book, it hit me that arguably most people think of entrepreneurs as leaders in their field, the out of the box thinkers. Maybe we hear this statistic and some of the strengths that a dyslexia diagnosis can bring. But the power of this quote is in the juxtaposition of potential strengths right next to a potential or sizable concern. We read this statistic of 41% of prisoners are thought to have dyslexia. As a quick side note, I've heard up to 80% based on some research. And when we hear that statistic, we think about the potential challenges of a dyslexia diagnosis. Overall, what came to mind when I read this quote in his book is the difference that support and education about dyslexia can mean for the person diagnosed. When someone with dyslexia has a name for the challenges they've experienced, it makes it less scary. It gives a reason for the suffering. It opens the door to finding critical solutions or support, and it sheds light on why they are having difficulty and that it has nothing to do with their intelligence. Without support, children and adults with dyslexia are faced with creating their own story for why they have challenges. And most will assume they aren't smart or aren't capable when that's just not true. When the suffering is so great, they will believe lies about themselves and their worth will suffer, and so will we because we'll never see the leaders that could have been. So I hope, if nothing else, this serves as a call to action to parents, teachers, and other people in the lives of children or anyone having difficulty in a learning environment to get curious about why someone is having difficulty. We never know what story a child is telling themselves about their ability when they are struggling and their classmates aren't. And I would love to see more of those students supported so they can become the best versions of themselves. I also want to cover a few other reasons why I believe there is tremendous value in learning about dyslexia. I think most parents would agree when their child is struggling, they would do almost anything to be able to help them. The problem is, as with most situations, if we don't know the reason why our child is struggling, it makes it hard to help. You've probably heard the expression, you have to name it to tame it. This is commonly used around the idea of emotions and feelings. The thought process is once you know what a child is feeling and you help them see how they are feeling, you can help them through the process of overcoming the emotion. But this also applies to any academic challenges a child may face. With dyslexia specifically, you can't get help for something if you don't know what that something is. Dyslexia requires an intensive, specific type of instruction to help kids soar. So once we have a name for it and understand it, we can start to formulate a plan. Also, on an emotional level, and I speak from personal experience here, if you are left sitting in this space where you have more questions than answers and you're not sure where to turn or what to do, it wears you out. It's not fun to sit in anxiety over what to do or how to do it. And denial, sorry to say, isn't really an option here. So I quickly found the best way to move forward is really to learn all I could about the challenges my child and later children were facing. Knowing more allowed me to walk with my child on this journey. I was no longer scratching my head. I was reading books or talking with other parents who were struggling, or more often than not, just reading about and listening to other parents who have been at this a lot longer than I had. I turned into a sponge to learn from others, especially people who are dyslexic. And I also asked my children a lot of questions about their experience. And once I knew more, I could do more and I could do better for my kids as we navigated the new experience together. When we're talking about something like dyslexia that isn't rare, statistically speaking, you probably already know one person who has dyslexia, if not many, many more. Also, you can be a huge ally or advocate, especially if you are not dyslexic. This puts you in this allows you to help in a way that doesn't put the burden on others who are already dealing with the challenges of dyslexia, let alone trying to advocate for others. You can be one of the biggest assets to not only your children, but for other people's children and adults who have suffered. In this process, you aren't just supporting your children and others, you are destigmatizing the disorder. After all, being born with dyslexia is no more in a person's control than what eye color they receive from a parent. And finally, we need as many people as possible to understand what it is so that we can help identify and help those who have it, especially children. So many children slip through the cracks of being identified, and thus they don't get a diagnosis or support they need to succeed. You'll learn more about what those supports look like in the future modules. Now I want to present a case study of sorts. This is my personal experience with my son who has dyslexia and ADHD. I felt this was important to share in case you find yourself in the same situation. I wanted you to know you aren't alone. I also wanted to share this with a small plea to please trust your gut. It's something I wasn't told until after we were already into the diagnosis. So even when I had reservations about my son's experience pretty early on in his educational experience, the overall feeling was, I'm sure he'll be okay. In summary, I didn't listen to my gut. The other thing I'll mention in case there are teachers that are in this course, most parents don't have a frame of reference that teachers do. We don't see our child in a class with 25 other kids. We just see them and their abilities kind of in a vacuum. So as parents, we don't always know what is worrisome and what is age appropriate. Similarly, as parents, we often think teachers will know our child has a disorder like dyslexia, but I've come to realize there are as many teachers who are confused about what dyslexia is as there are parents. So, all this to say, it's best to educate ourselves to make sure we know as much as we can in order to help our kids as best we can. I'm going to review a couple things that I noticed with my son. With him being my first, I didn't really have a frame of reference or context to measure his abilities or milestones against. This meant I didn't know what I didn't know, and I assumed everything was fine. It was only in retrospect that I learned there were multiple red flags. I was completely baffled and confused about why teaching my son to read was so hard. I felt ill equipped to teach him, and I went through a really tough period where I blamed myself for not being able to see the red flag sooner or help him better. I truly thought I was failing him. If I have described your experience, please know you are not alone. Let's dig in. My son has always loved stories. We read to him since he was a newborn. I bring this up because as a parent, I was told by teachers at parent teacher conferences that I just needed to read to him more. I always thought this was interesting because we had books everywhere and we read all the time. It's funny because we even started showing him books when he was still a newborn. I bought this baby animals book that's on the screen because I had heard that newborns can't see colors very clearly and that high contrast books and pictures are the way to go. So we would go through the pictures, name each animal, and describe them to him. He loved stories, but he was never interested in trying to read himself. He didn't want to open or hold a book. He was never interested in holding writing utensils, pens, pencils, markers, crayons, none of it. This didn't even really occur to me until we had our daughter a couple years after my son, who was, who has always wanted to color every day practically since the day she was born. In preschool and pre-K, children were asked to write their names every day they came into the classroom. He had difficulties with this despite us working with him repeatedly at home. He just couldn't get it. He also had a lot of difficulties with fine motor skills, which his preschool even acknowledged. Again, this wasn't something I even noticed until we had my daughter. Um, but the way this manifested in my son was that he didn't want to hold a pencil, couldn't button his pants, had a hard time with scissors, and wasn't interested in tying his shoes, among many other things. One of the biggest challenges or sorry, changes that did almost immediately raise a red flag in my mind was that his personality started to change once he started school, specifically kindergarten. We're a household that never says the word stupid, but when he was in kindergarten, I heard him call himself stupid. I spoke with his teacher, and she has said she was concerned or she said, sorry, that she was concerned with his ability to focus while in school, even in small groups. After an assessment, we found out he had ADHD with hyperactivity. Aha, I thought, maybe once we address his ADHD, everything will be better. As time went on in kindergarten and first grade, we were asked to do flashcards with him. I was often reminded by his teacher again and again, work on those flashcards we sent home. What they didn't know is that we were working on flashcards and that no matter how long or how many times we reviewed them, none of the letters, sounds, or words were sticking. It was as though as soon as I flipped the card, the flashcard over, the information went away from my son's brain and I couldn't figure out what was going on. Additionally, I remember several times I'd speak to my husband about my confusion over my son not being able to show what he knew. And this got worse as he was expected to write his answers as he got older. That was, like a non-starter. What was equally as puzzling is that on occasion, my son would pull out random information we had discussed months or even years prior. So I knew things were going in, but I just couldn't get them back out again at times that we needed them or wanted them. I found the inconsistencies in my son's knowledge was difficult for me to wrap my head around. It made me wonder what I had done to get some information to stick, but not the rest. You'll see the next bullet point come up in some signs of dyslexia, but often children with dyslexia will try to figure out what the story is by looking at the pictures. They may read a little, and then words that are longer, or if they don't want to try and sound out the word, or if they're tired, they may pick a word based on what's in the picture as opposed to reading what's on the page. Also, the homework, and we'll go into more detail about that second bullet point in just a little bit. Also, the homework my son's school gave him took us hours to complete. Writing a sentence for my son would take an hour. There were many nights I would write his teacher a note telling her we couldn't finish, even after working together for most of the evening. Truth be told, this is what stands out to me even to this day. As a learner that didn't have the same challenges, I would have never believed how a disorder like dyslexia robs the individual of time, but that is exactly what it does. This is something that I think most people don't understand, teachers included. But these homework sessions forever changed me and my level of compassion for anyone who has a learning difference. My son was working so incredibly hard, and I was working so hard to support him. And there was no school or life balance during that time, unless I decided to tell my son to quit working before we were even able to finish. That alone makes you feel like a failure. So I can't even imagine how hard it is for someone who doesn't have support and someone in their life telling them school doesn't define who they are. I could teach one whole class just about the issues with homework for our learners, but for the sake of this course, let's move to the last point. Even with all these challenges, he never had issues with comprehension unless he was trying to read something himself. You see, dyslexia doesn't affect the area of the brain responsible for comprehension. So as long as he could listen to a story through audiobook or with me reading, he could pull out even the most minute details and answer any question someone asked him about a story. He was and still is extremely observant and can recognize so many interesting parts to things he had listened to. Sadly, this is something most teachers wouldn't notice because he would wordsmith answers if he was asked to write his response instead of orally giving a response to a question. The writing hindered his ability to show what he knows. Now that I've shared my experience, and maybe it sounds a little bit like your experience with your child, let's look at some signs that point to dyslexia so you know what to look out for in your child or other children in your life. Whoa, there we go. On this page, I've pasted a list of signs of dyslexia. This list was created by Dr. Sally Shaywitz, but you may often see this or something like it shared by others. What you'll notice in the earlier years relates to those phonemic skills and phonological skills we reviewed in part one of this module, such as rhyming, letter sounds, letters that correspond to the sounds you hear. Where you see mispronounce, uh, the where you see the bullet point that says mispronounce familiar words, think of words like instead of spaghetti, it might be pischetti, or animal might be pronounced as aminal. It's important to take these signs as a whole, not just individually. What I mean by that is if a child says Paschetti but doesn't have any other signs listed, the likelihood of them having dyslexia is extremely low. Usually parents and or teachers will see several of these signs in a child who has dyslexia, not just one. And the biggie on this list is the last bullet point, a family history of reading and or spelling difficulties, because remember, there is a genetic component to dyslexia. Here we're looking at kindergarten and first grade, and specifically the difficulties that you may notice in these grades. Once again, you'll notice more phonological skills or lack of phonological skills show up here. For instance, doesn't understand words, come apart, is really alluding to a lack of skills with syllable division or even knowing what syllables are. Remember, if we have deficits at the most foundational skills, phonemes, those individual units of sound, it often makes sense that our students would have difficulty with words and especially words that have multi-syllables. Some strengths of K in first grade. Um, Here you'll see examples of the other side of dyslexia. I guess you could say the other side of the dyslexia coin. The things we don't talk enough about is the fact that kids with dyslexia can have really great out of the box thinking and problem solving solutions. They can often be good at puzzles and 3D shapes like building with Legos. They may have amazing artistic talents. And as with my son and daughter, they both have extensive vocabularies. Here we have a pretty big age group of second grade all the way through high school, but it's also broken out into a few parts: reading, speaking, and on the next slide, school life and then strengths. After all that we've reviewed in part one of this module, everything on the screen probably makes a lot of sense to you. When our students have skills, or sorry, when our students have issues with their phonological processing and skills, you may, as this list states, notice that reading is slow and awkward, or that your child has trouble reading unfamiliar words and may even guess at words. Additionally, they may avoid reading out loud. With regard to speaking, you may notice pauses or difficulty finding the right word. They may make a few mistakes in word choices, for example, saying tornado for volcano. They also may mispronounce words, especially longer words, and due to slight processing delays, they also may require extra time to respond to questions. Okay. And on this slide, you see some signs of dyslexia for students who are second through high school as the skills relate to school and life. It's not uncommon to hear parents talk about their child who has dyslexia having issues remembering days of the week, months of the year. They may have difficulty remembering telephone numbers and random lists of things. Many students with dyslexia may choose to sign up for American Sign Language if the school will count it towards their foreign language credit, because learning a foreign language can be incredibly challenging for our students. You may see poor spelling, messy handwriting, and low self esteem. Can we talk about that for a moment? Um, as parents, we know if left to assume, our children will create many stories about experiences they've had or even themselves. Our kids often need us to help them make sense of things that have happened to them or things they are learning. This includes about themselves. Because remember, we've had way more experience at this thing called life than they have. And physiologically, our brains have had more time to mature and they're typically better at handling emotions and thoughts in general than when we were younger. I know as parents, we may believe kids can handle more than we may believe that our kids can handle more than they can. But when it comes to self-esteem and decision-making skills or being able to think holistically about almost anything, many kids aren't emotionally or physiologically ready to handle that just yet on their own. They need us as parents to tell them they are smart and capable. They need us to believe in them and to say we believe in them. Think about your own experience as an adult and think about a time when you were out of your comfort zone or experiencing anything new or challenging. And imagine how nice it would have been to have someone in your corner saying, "You got this. You can do this." Our kids also need to know that we love them no matter what, and that at the end of the day, school and grades don't define who they are. I'm sure you already do this, but I was thinking about my own experience as a parent and how I often needed this reminder. So I hope this comes across as I genuinely mean it. Just a friendly reminder about our kids, about what our kids might, need from us. I loved my school experience, so I really had to take a long, hard look at what my expectations were for my son and now my daughter with regard to school. Because even if my desire for them to love school was from a good place, the message I was still telling them is that school is important and that it's a place to grow and love and listen. For a lot of kids, that is exactly what school is. And how great is that, right? But what I've learned over time is that it's also okay if my kids find more value in activities and learning outside of school. There is so much that can shape our kids, and school doesn't have to be the number one thing because what I've found is that most schools can't always see, truly appreciate, or celebrate the gifts that neurodivergent kids bring. At awards ceremonies for school, it's going to be academic in nature, meaning grades, not character or kindness or amazing problem solving skills, but grades and performance. I'm generalizing here, but it's to make a point that we don't always have to build up school to be the one, the only, or even the best thing in our kids' lives. And on that note, let's discuss some strengths. Here, we're still reviewing second grade through high school. Kids with dyslexia, by and large, are amazing thinkers. They often learn best when there is meaning behind the learning and not just rote memorization. So that's typically why spelling tests can be incredibly challenging for our kids with dyslexia. They have the ability to see the big picture. They have solid comprehension skills, typically when something is read to them. I pulled this screenshot or screen snip straight from Yale's webpage, so I can't do anything about the typo in there. It's worth stating again that their vocabulary is often more sophisticated than their peers, and they may excel in areas that are not dependent on reading. If you go to the source link on the screen, you can also find additional signs of dyslexia for what they refer to as young adults and adults, if that's something that is something you're looking for. Although we will cover a lot of resources in part three, I have already provided a few book recommendations in part one, so I thought I would sprinkle a few in for part two as well. Here, I'm focusing on books that may be helpful for kids to read. The first book is perfect for elementary age kids. It showcases a couple cognitive and physical differences and abilities, and dyslexia is one that is covered. So is ADHD. I loved the approach this book takes. That is, instead of just noticing or thinking someone is different, get curious about them and learn more about them and what makes them unique. Hank Zipser, book number two on the screen, is actually a series of books, and I love it because first, it's entertaining. Second, it's written about a boy who has dyslexia, and third, it's co-written by Henry Winkler, who also has dyslexia. You may remember him in Happy Days as the Fonz. Next up, the third book on the screen is the Percy Jackson book, and this is part of a series as well. And the first in the series is the book that's shown. It's called The Lightning Thief. Here, as with Hank Sipser, the main character, Percy Jackson, has dyslexia. What I love about this book is that although the book mentions Percy's dyslexia, it doesn't hit you over the head with it. And it's an extremely entertaining story with many ties to Greek mythology. All of these are great books, and when I'm not reading to my kids, we'll listen to audiobooks while running errands in the car or on road trips. My kids have read several series of books that way, and I've never even purchased an audiobook for them. I use the Libby app that is free with our library, and I think many libraries across the country. If you're not sure, reach out to your library and ask about the Libby app. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. When I listened to this podcast, I knew it was something I had to share with you. If you haven't heard of this podcast, I urge you to listen to it as soon as possible. I wish this was available years ago when I suspected something was wrong in my son's educational experience. As it turns out, they were not teaching him to read. They were using Fontes and Pinnell books, leveled literacy intervention, and teaching the MSV three cueing method, which consists of three different cues: graphic, syntactic, and semantic. And what those mean are graphic cues. It's, what do the letters tell you about what the word might be? So when a child is looking at a word, the graphic cues would be, what do the letters tell you about what the word might be? What does that word start with? It's a B. Oh, could it be a boat? Could it be a barn? Could it be, what can you learn about the word? Syntactic cues. It's what kind of word could it be? For example, a noun or a verb. If you're reading a story, is that, a person, place, or thing, or is it an action word? And then semantic cues speak to what word would make sense here based on the context. So what's going on around that word? These cues are based off of the late Mari Clay's theory of how students learn to read. But what we've since learned is that the theory she developed actually mimics how poor readers try to read. What research was clear about, and is still very clear about, is that we must learn how to read by knowing phonemes, those are sounds, graphemes, which are letters, and phonics, that's the connection between phonemes and graphemes, or sounds and letters. A little word of caution here before you listen to this podcast. If you are a parent of a struggling reader, this podcast will probably make you both extremely sad and very angry about the popularity of reading and writing programs that are not based in the science of reading, the harm to children's ability to read and self confidence, and the amount of money these inefficient programs have made their creators and publishers, including one driving around in a Maserati. So please give yourself permission to take breaks as you listen. Excuse me. But I urge you to finish the series because I think it's critical for parents who are also becoming advocates for their children to hear this story, because we really were, and many teachers, many good meaning teachers, were sold a story about something that would work, and it didn't. And it has harmed so many students, my children included. I I could say a lot about this, but I won't. So yes, please, you can get this. I've seen it on Spotify. I've seen it on Apple. Oh, and it even says it on the screen. So great resource. You can click it also when you have the PDF. Okay. And then next up, I may be putting the cart before the horse, adding this slide into this particular portion of the module. But because I just mentioned the science of reading, and as you kind of go about this experience, you will hear science of reading a lot. So because I just mentioned it, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about it. Don't worry if what I'm about to tell you doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We'll talk about it again later in the course. If you look into the world of reading and literacy, especially in the K-12 arena, you may start to hear this phrase called the science of reading. Science of reading is the name for a body of research about how the brain reads and how we can best teach reading. It spans years, even decades, in some with quite a bit of research. And as we learn more, it continues to grow. There isn't one researcher or one study or a handful of studies. It's thousands from trustworthy and intelligent leaders in their fields. If you're interested to learn more, I have a link to share with you so you can start to dig in. I will caution you, most of the research is quite dense, but it is important work. Have I read it all? No. but I have to read a lot of it for the course that I'm in right now to teach multisensory teaching reading intervention. So do you have to read the research? No, but you should make sure that the tutor or teacher, like me, who would work with your child in particular with dyslexia to provide intensive instruction in reading, understands the research and will use the latest to provide research-based instruction. You can ask them directly, does the science of reading inform your work? If so, how? Can you give me some examples? If they mention phonemic awareness, phonological processing, phonics, or terms like direct, explicit, systematic, and cumulative, diagnostic, and prescriptive to describe their approach, they more than likely are knowledgeable about the research. You don't have to list all of those or write them down. I know I went through them very quick. Don't worry, we will talk about them in great depth later. If they have credentials from accredited programs, which you can find on the International Dyslexia Association's website, you can rest assured they are knowledgeable about the science of reading. Another term you may hear often is multisensory. Although there isn't a tremendous amount of research for this specific element of teaching kids how to read and its efficacy, it appears this lack of research is mostly a function of the qualitative nature of this element. Reading by nature is a multisensory experience, so it's hard to control for or remove that element of multisensory teaching or learning to accurately research it. It's already woven in. And I'm of the belief that the more senses we can use, the better, because it creates stronger neural pathways in our brains for the information we're learning. If you didn't catch all those terms, like I said, don't worry. We'll be going into depth about these later in the module. Okay, and finally, oof, this one tears at my heart. I can't leave this portion of our presentation without showing this image. It was shared in an online support group for parents of children with dyslexia. I can't think of a better depiction of how it feels for our children and for individuals with dyslexia learning to read. Imagine how it feels to see all your classmates excelling at something that doesn't make sense to you. This image is the reason we need to learn about dyslexia, so no child is left behind solely because they weren't given the right type of reading instruction they needed to be able to excel just like their classmates. The quote I often come back to is dyslexia is not a learning problem, it's an instruction problem. If there are any teachers in this course, please don't take offense to this. It's just the truth. And if you're a parent, please know this problem is much, much larger than teachers. Our legislature and policies that inform teacher preparation programs are light years behind the national research on the topic of reading, and thus, many teacher preparation programs aren't giving teacher candidates the training they need in order to teach their children with dyslexia how to read. Because remember, the Orton Gillingham method I'll tell you more about in part 3 helps every reader and hurts no reader. Okay, so um, now it is break time. This was an extremely dense section of the module. If you were watching these back to back, I would love to offer you some unsolicited advice to give yourself a break. Take some time to stretch, grab a snack, or even just sit for a while without me in your ears before you head into part 3. And when you're ready, I'll see you over there. Thanks so much.